Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the special business meeting for Tuesday, July 19th. We're on to item 4.1, Woodfibre LNG and Fortis BC work plan for 2022 and 2023. And I am turning things over to Mr. Buxton, our General Manager of Community Planning and Sustainability.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Unfortunately, I don't seem to be able to fix that display issue on the screen and get rid of the box on the screen, unfortunately. So,
I'll do that.
oh, well, that solves that problem. We spent 10 minutes trying to figure that out. Thank you. Now I'm sufficiently flustered. So today I'll give you a highlight of the numerous sort of elements of work that we're having to perform as part of the Woodfibre and Fortis BC EAO approved projects. And as you can see, it's a little tricky to read, but there are quite a few moving parts that we have or will have to do as part of both projects, or as we see them, fundamentally one project in the community. In terms of the just some highlights with respect to the two different elements of the project. With respect to Fortis, the EA is currently looking at the amendment application for workforce housing, which only really discusses the area going from 7 to 17 acres. That application is before the EA. We're waiting for a decision on that. It doesn't discuss the particular location in any specific detail. We have reviewed 3 drafts of Fortis management plans, those being community services and infrastructure, traffic control, and emergency management. Those plans have been submitted to the EA for approval. They have not been approved. We are currently back and forth with Fortis on those plans. I think particularly the community services and infrastructure management plan, where Fortis have done some public engagement, particularly on that through a community table, which is a select group of stakeholders. There hasn't been any significant public exposure and review of that plan, and that's one of the items we noted in our critique that went to Fortis and the EA. The traffic control management and emergency management plan, there hasn't been a lot of public engagement on that, but to be honest, those are fairly technical documents. They're fairly dry. Those are best handled through a smaller stakeholder group of directly affected stakeholders, which would include the district amongst others. So I'm not sure that there's a need for those to get extensive review and comment in the public realm, but they need to be out in the public realm. Fortis has requested pre-application meetings for both the temporary workforce accommodation up towards Powerhouse Springs and towards the Quest area on that land, vacant land, and for a laydown and storage area just to the north and east of Valleycliff. We don't have applications for either of those. We've just done pre-application meetings on those. I say, in amongst other sort of elements, Fortis has been doing some public engagement around the temporary workforce housing, and we expect that to be ongoing in the next few months. Fortis wants that work camp to be open late Q1, early Q2 of 2023, which is a very, very tight timeline, given where we're at. Because of the lead time, that needs to be in place so that the tunneling crews, which I think have basically a 3-year lead time, the hope is that work starts 2023. So that's the pressure on that timeline. So TUPs are council's discretion. They would come to council, so they're entirely within the purview of the district. We suspect that those applications, when they come in, will wind through at least until the early new year. So these are months, not weeks, in terms of processing an application. In terms of the Woodfibre side of the work that is ongoing. Some discussions around use at Darrell Bay, the tax agreement, those discussions are ongoing. They have been for a little while. Talking about community benefits rather than a promotional subsidization. So the aim is to enable certainty for Woodfibre and for the district in terms of a long-term, perhaps 10-year tax agreement. Otherwise, it's left year to year. That decision is left on a year-to-year basis with council making decisions on mill rates. So this provides benefits to the community and provides certainty to the applicant. In terms of some of the more detailed elements with Woodfibre, we're awaiting a decision on the flotel. That's the floating work camp anchored just off of the site on the west side of Howe Sound. We're waiting on that decision from the EAO. It's been a long time, probably best part of 2 years since that process closed at the EA. So we're waiting on that to come forth. We have been working with them on a DPA 1 or riparian application around site pre-development, site clearing. There's a lot of work to be done on clearing that site and preparing it. It doesn't constitute the commencement of construction that the EA considers the project to start, but they are active on the site, removing rails. Some of the buildings have been demolished, removing concrete and processing concrete pads, closure of the landfill that's on the site. We have seen tables of contents and early versions of the management plans being community services and infrastructure, traffic management and emergency management from Woodfibre. Those are at a very early stage, and just yesterday I have seen a public engagement process that they're proposing to use that does involve, I think, fairly reasonable amounts of public engagement for those plans. So they're approaching it rather than at a community table level, that more at the general community level, and getting those out into community. Again, sorry, as noted earlier, the dates on those three, the community services, traffic control, emergency management, say fall 2023. That actually should be spring, summer 2023. The aim is to have them wrapped and sent to the EA. Those are where those plans, all of those management plans, we are actively consulted, but the decision at the end of the day rests with the EA. We have seen a pre-application meeting request for Woodfibre for the flotel. That hasn't taken place yet. And I say on-site preparation work is underway already. We do continue to work on a number of these, mostly the management plans at this point in time. We do have capacity funding agreements in place with both applicants to fund positions. We have seen funding from Woodfibre, and we are likely in the process of bringing on a planner to help with the construction management plans and the TUPs. We also still have a contract planning consultant helping on these applications. That person has a long history and so comes well equipped to handle that work. And that funding may also, if necessary, provide for an environmental specialist in the engineering department if that's needed. But right now we're looking at, it's largely for the next year, a lot of planning work in TUPs and management plans. So I think that's a sort of an overall summary. Let's say we'll get into DPs around form and character and building permits and road use permits once the construction has actually commenced. So, I mean, we're going to see work at the Woodfibre site, both on the LNG plant and on a compressor station for Fortis. There's also a tunneling site at the rail yards. So there's 1, 2. The pipeline, when it comes through town, will be a sort of a rolling work site as it moves, I believe, east to west through town through 2023, 2024. There is the proposed location for a temporary workforce camp. So again, a third site. And then the stockpile and laydown area northeast of Valleycliff is a fourth site. So lots of moving parts on this that we're chugging through as time goes by.
Thank you, Mr. Buxton. Council, do you have questions? Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Through the chair, did you say we received capacity funding from Woodfibre, but not yet from Fortis?
Correct. We have agreements, and I'm anticipating that Fortis funding will arrive early next week.
And then do we have a sense of when the flotel amendment has been delayed, when Woodfibre might need the flotel? I hear you when you say that the workers from Fortis are perhaps a little bit sooner. Do we have a sense of the timeline for the workers for Woodfibre?
I don't have that detail memorized, but so no, I can't answer that question. But it's certainly the tunnel crew is sort of the first significant element of the workforce to arrive because of it's the long timeline to have that finished in time for the plant to be open. They need to be in the ground a lot sooner. So.
And just one more, and I think that this is probably a question for Fortis, and so you can redirect my question to them. But the timeline is very short, as you indicated in your presentation, with respect to when they expect to have workers here in early 2023, spring 2023, and the process of our TUP applications. And so how do we reconcile those two timelines into reality?
Well, all I can say is right now is it's going to be very tight if we were to start right now to deal with that. I mean, for us to be able to process it, we need internal resources. It looks like we're getting those. So, but the public process that goes along with a TUP of this nature adds to the length of time. So it's getting very tight for us to be able to meet these timelines, even with resources.
Councillor Herford.
Thank you. I'm curious how a couple of these pieces fit together, where the traffic control management plan is through the EAO and we're consulted on it, but then we've got road use permits, which is a district responsibility. And how do those things interact? Does one presuppose the other? And then how does that change as these TUP areas come into consideration as far as triggering things like whether it's a traffic, some sort of traffic impact studies or any other due diligence? Is that a separate process from these ones that are listed here?
Well, through the chair, the road use permits are very specific to a sector of road that's being closed or worked on at a very specific point in time. So if they're chugging down in Finch at some point, there would be a road use permit for that sector of Finch. The traffic control management plan is really the strategic view of how we're going to manage traffic generally in the community, of which Finch would be a part of that. So the road use permits are done days in advance when we know that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week, they're going to be on Finch. So we need to have permit and traffic management in place for that particular site on that particular set of days.
So, okay, thank you for that clarity. So then as we would consider, it sounds like we've got a couple of TUPs coming our way. We would also have traffic impacts, but those are would be handled inside the TUP process, or are some of these processes linked to that?
Sorry, I obviously misunderstood. Yes, the TUPs will probably, well, the flotel may not, but certainly if we get an application for a temporary workforce accommodation on a side up the Crown Forest Service Road, yes, there will be a traffic impact assessment as part of that TUP application that will deal specifically with that particular part of traffic control.
Okay. And as part of this project, you mentioned that the tunneling. I've been asking, and I get that this might not be a question for us, but for you, but I want to understand where staff is on the tunneling, the spoils coming from the tunneling. I think it's going to generate a lot of traffic as they move it to wherever it needs to go. So I've been requesting this information from Fortis, and I have yet to receive it. That part of the movement, where would that be captured in this regulations, or does staff have thoughts on that particular topic?
Either or both of the community services infrastructure master plan or the traffic control master plan for the Fortis application.
So those would be EAO, not district controlled, how those movements happen?
Sorry, through the chair, yes, but once we get into the mechanics of when they can move them, that's a road use, probably a road use permit. We've also discussed the issue of having the traffic control management plan talks about having agreements in place with respect to level of maintenance required on those roads. So what quality of road are they at? Are they at when they start work, and they need to maintain or improve that level of service? So yeah, we acknowledge that temporarily we need to manage that in terms of we can't have tracks running 24/7. So we'll manage that through the traffic control management plan or road use permits. And then, yeah, that level of traffic is going to damage our roads. So having agreements on at the point at which that this is the level of service that you need to maintain. So if you destroy the road, you have to replace the road. So
thank you. Thanks for that clarity. My concern with this is that that tunneling on this end exits into a rail yard, and this conversation is presupposing that it's going in individual dump trucks to move through town. And when or how would it be appropriate to encourage them to use the infrastructure that's existing on site to minimize those impacts so that we don't have to do those steps? And is that something that's been discussed so far, or is there an opportunity to do that forthcoming?
I think, again, that opportunity is forthcoming. Again, and this is one of the complication is that both Fortis and Woodfibre will use contracting or contractors to effect the work. So in some cases, they're trying to kick the can down the road to the consultant. And frankly, I'm not that interested in having to reach an agreement with a third party. As far as I'm concerned, we need to reach an agreement with Fortis, and you deal with your contractor. With the spoils, I don't know that they've actually found a home for them yet. So again, the contractor will find a home, and then at that point, we're going to have to negotiate with Fortis or the contractor about how they move those spoils and whether or not they can move them by rail. If they could, that would be great. Obviously, you're going to need the infrastructure to load and the infrastructure to offload at some point at the point of destination. So I guess great if that can work, that would be, I think, ideal. I don't think they know where those spoils are going yet, though.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, thanks. I have a few questions and comments. I'll try and move quickly. Just to clarify then, these dates are Woodfibre and Fortis's aspirational goals, but they're not necessarily realistic dates?
I think they're a little bit of both there. Some of the dates I've assigned based on my best estimation. Some of them are, yes, if you're looking at late 2022, early 2023, that's aspirational. As I said to Councillor Stoner, it's going to be tricky to meet that deadline.
Okay, thanks. And I use that term aspirational very loosely in this context. In the public engagement column, is that meant to be the current state, or that's their goal? Because in a few places it talks about limited, but their EAO conditions actually requires them. It seems to do a fair bit of public engagement on all of these plans. I'm just wanting to clarify what we're saying with that column.
I see those again. That is my description. So I think limited is it's a graded scale. Significant means there's just a lot more of it in terms of volume. Limited means there's less with respect to the significant projects. I don't think it has a translation to an absolute amount. It doesn't mean limited means none or nil. It just means it's much less than the other ones.
Okay, I think we may want to circle back to that, reading the expectations, and that leads to my one comment. I disagree that these documents and plans are overly technical. I've spoken to a couple of people I know that are particularly interested. One is recently moved on from the BC Oil and Gas Commission as a regulator and has a great deal of concerns and knowledge. Another person I've been speaking to is an engineer that did safety planning for the oil and gas sector in Alberta, worked on their behalf, supports LNG, but is very concerned about these plans and has the expertise and the desire to be involved in these. And we know, for example, the Fortis road planning is going to have massive impacts on our community as a whole, not just a few businesses. So I think our stance moving forward needs to understand that our community in general is very technically savvy and has the capacity and desire, I think, to be involved. And so I don't think we should write that off. I'm just wondering, we do talk about some things that we don't regulate, and Clean BC has updated new emissions requirements. And I understand that fossil fuel operators like Woodfibre and Fortis have to demonstrate that they'll be able to meet the new Clean BC targets and caps. So I'm just wondering, do we plan to sort of assess that or keep tabs on that like these other things, or do we have insight into where they are on that issue?
No, I don't think we have any plans to administer the province's requirements. We have our own to look after.
Okay, yeah, I was just asking because some of like the flotel amendments and stuff aren't ours either. So I was just sort of wondering, if we're, I guess what I'm taking from this is there are other provincial and federal possibly regulations they have to meet, and we're not necessarily keeping tabs on them. So this is sort of what we're focusing on, but it's not the whole picture for them.
Correct. Yeah, there's a lot more work going off with the EA, the Oil and Gas Commission, the BC Utilities Commission, that we don't see and we're not involved with.
Okay, and then I just want to make a couple of statements to test their correctness, and so I'm hoping you can clarify if I'm not correct. So signing a tax deal, as I understand it, is not a requirement. If we didn't, they would fall back on the regular BC assessment, which, as you mentioned, would be our mill rate, and that is an option for us to do. But so also in pursuing a tax deal, or even if we were granting or exploring discretionary like temporary use permits and things that we don't have to grant, those would not necessarily indicate any endorsement. We may have reasons for engaging in some of this work, but an endorsement of the project and so on is not necessarily implied in these things. Is that correct?
So you made a few different statements. I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure which one Mr. Buxton should reply to, because there was one about the tax agreement and then you started talking about the TUPs. So
Yeah, I guess I was meaning to assert a bunch of his statements, which I believe are true. And if anything I said was incorrect, and I'm hoping none of it was, but to the degree anything was incorrect, if Mr. Buxton would say, oh, that's where you've misunderstood.
Okay. TUPs and tax agreements are TUPs and tax agreements. I don't know that they speak to an endorsement of the project in a larger scheme. That's not why they do it. It's a temporary use permit. We're approving a permit, or we're approving a road use permit. I'm hesitant to say it expresses anything more than it's a permit, or it's a tax agreement, or it's a lease agreement.
Okay, I guess that's what I was sort of looking for, trying to, because we've declared a climate emergency, and there's a motion coming forward in our OCP. So I'm just wondering how we reconcile some of this work in terms of TUPs and so on, which is discretionary. We don't have to do it, and trying to be clear then that just because we consider or even approve a TUP or tax deal that isn't, unless we say explicitly, isn't an endorsement necessarily of the project.
So I just want staff to be careful that you're not being philosophical on issues that are really up to council to decide. So if you could just speak to the substance. It's up to council to consider the philosophical side of the climate emergency and that sort of thing. Staff have brought forward a report that outlines the work that's in front of us. And I think we're statutorily required to process something like a TUP. It has nothing to do with endorse or not endorse. It's a legislative process. We have to process that. So maybe staff can.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. Yes, so most permits or the work that you see on this table, and for the public, it is in the council agenda. So if people can't see it on the screen, the statutory requirements are that the applications go through council. So that part's not discretionary. What's discretionary is council's decision when that permit comes forward. And again, it depends on the actual permit. And now we're getting into real planning 101. Whether it's a development permit, building permits are at the staff level, TUP over a certain threshold comes to council. For example, the Fortis TUP for a work camp would come to council. There's the discretion. As Mr. Buxton said, the endorsement is not, staff would never come forward with an overall ask around yes or no on this project as a whole. It's each in its own little compartment. And we will leave the philosophical discussion to you. And to answer the initial question, if a tax agreement is not completed between the two parties so that each party is satisfied, the fallback absolutely is the traditional tax regime using BC assessment and mill rates.
Yeah, no, I think that's the clarity I was hoping to get. I have people asking me, so does this mean you support the project now and so on? And so I want to be clear, I guess, as clear as we can, that there are certain things we have to process, certain things, even if it's discretionary, processing or the decision and so on doesn't necessarily speak to a general endorsement one way or the other. Just trying to have that clarity for the people that are asking that question.
Other questions? Council Friend.
Thanks, Mayor. In the staff report, it's noted that if a negotiated tax agreement can't be achieved, Woodfibre LNG will pay property tax according to the regular process using BC assessment. We've just heard that out of the previous line of questioning. And then that leads to the major industry tax rate. So I'm interested in anything staff can share about the mechanics of such a shift off of a negotiated tax agreement to the BC assessment process. What does that look like? Is it one side simply saying we're out, or do the two sides agree that it can't be reached? Any thoughts? I'd appreciate that.
Through the mayor, that's an interesting question. We haven't gotten to that part of the process yet. I think ultimately what the message is to the community is that have no fear, WLNG will be taxed. It's just if an agreement isn't reached, there is the traditional method. Where that impasse is reached, I can't say yet. Yeah, I think if we just don't get an agreement between the two parties that anyone's happy with, it would fall back.
Ms. Glendale, maybe you could speak to the premium.
Absolutely. So to provide more clarity, especially for those in the community that are listening and less familiar with it, perhaps, is that it would seem intuitive to just use the traditional method. However, WLNG, for the purpose of their business planning, is looking for certainty over the next, it's a 10-year period. In exchange for that certainty, the district can glean benefit. If the agreement is such that this council is not happy, or the council and that's sitting is not happy with the benefit, or otherwise LNG is not happy with the agreement, we'd hit an impasse. The BC assessment method kicks in as soon as construction starts. So that would be one mechanism as well in terms of timing.
One of the questions I had, Mr. Buxton, and we have advocated, and this is in the public record with the Environmental Assessment Office, is that these projects were approved separately. Their documents are not speaking to each other, which leaves it to the district to have to figure out, okay, how does this traffic management plan speak to this traffic management plan, and how the timelines overlap, and what's the cumulative impact on our community. And we have expressed to the AO that that actually is not our job to do. It should be up to the proponents to be very clear about that and for us to then be able to review it. So are we seeing, with these plans starting to come in and you being able to see their tables of contents and what's included, are these proponents finally working together to present to us a unified vision of the overall impact on our community, or are they still very much separate plans?
They're still very much separate plans. We haven't seen any effort on the part of Fortis to provide that sort of crossover. My most recent communication with WLNG around the looking at the schedule over the next 2 years has drawn in Fortis. So there is a three-party or three-way discussion going to take place in the near future around looking at, okay, what are all the processes we're going to have to, the hoops we're going to have to jump through in the next 2 or 3 years. So there is a little bit of hope, but whether or not that is going to be translated into material in the management plans is yet to be seen, and it has not yet been seen in any of the plans submitted that I've seen. So we're still left to try and cut and paste from one into the other and sort of combine the effects to know what we're dealing with as a community.
I know we've requested a meeting at UBCM with the ministry again to talk about this issue, but given that Fortis has already submitted its plans, is this feedback that staff have provided to the AO again, that this is what a key part that's missing in the plans?
Yes, we have, yeah.
Thank you. Council, other questions? Councillor Pettengill?
Just picking up on the mayor's line of questioning a little bit, one of the other issues is because we hear about subcontractors and so on, and I believe it was the last Fortis open house at Squamish where there's some questions, and I believe for some of them, if this was the place I'm thinking of, some of the responses were along the lines of, oh yeah, you know, our contractor would be responsible for that. And so just as there seems to be some challenge with Woodfibre and Fortis working together, as we provide feedback to these plans, are we able to ensure that there's a mechanism that Fortis or Woodfibre, or ultimately Fortis, takes responsibility if things go south, if mitigations need to be made, and that there's some sort of mechanism, formal mechanism or accountability, that they don't get to push it off and point at a subcontractor and so on. And, you know, I think the other week I mentioned Coastal GasLink, and one of their subcontractors is, they're sort of pointing fingers back and forth around a sexual assault relates in relation to a work camp, and neither sort of willing to take responsibility. And so as these things happen, is there a way to capture that in these work plans and make sure that these two big parties, or ultimately Woodfibre, who's at the head of the whole thing, takes responsibility and has an obligation to resolve these or deal with them?
Through the chair, I think that's where we need to hold Woodfibre and Fortis's feet to the fire on the management plans, particularly the community services, and not allow them to say, well, we'll deal with that with our contractor will provide that detail. I think my response to date is no, you will provide that detail and you will deal with your contractor, because we don't need to be dealing with the district dealing with a contractor, and the contractor points at Fortis and Fortis points the finger back. That's what we don't want to deal with. So we have been trying to push that with Fortis. The difficulty being is that these plans are not approved by the district. They are approved by the EA. failing that, we'll deal with it in the TUP. So deal with me now, deal with me later. You'll deal with me. So, and I'm not interested in dealing with your contractor. I'm interested in dealing with you. So.
All right. Yeah, Councillor Stoner, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the update. And I'm still frustrated that we're putting so much time and energy to try and piece these two projects together into a coherent vision for our community. I'm just curious, you mentioned that the capacity funding from Fortis hasn't come forward yet, but it sounds like we're still doing a fair bit of work on their applications, and there's been pre-app meetings for the TUPs. So I'm just curious, at what point do we, like, I guess, let me frame that question of, is it having an impact on our staff workload at this point, the applications that are coming forward without having that capacity funding in place yet?
Not with respect to the pre-application meetings. They're one-offs, and we deal with those as a matter of course. That's part of the cost of being in the development business for us. I actually do have funding in place that's residual from 2019. So, and we're using a contractor to cover that. But yes, we are going to need that funding in place and a planner in place before we get going on TUP applications. That's just plain and simple. So.
Council, I wonder if it might be helpful for this kind of summary to come back to council on a quarterly basis, just to keep tabs. And so maybe I'll move that staff bring back the Fortis and Woodfibre project work lists on a quarterly basis to update council. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Stoner. Any thoughts? Councillor Herford?
Thank you. I'll just reiterate the need for these two entities to align their plans, and that's work they should be doing and not be downloading to us. We've heard that that's a direction that they're working in, but I've yet to see evidence of that, and that's something that I would encourage whoever's looking at this next quarterly update to continue to apply pressure to, as I know our staff is. So thank you for bringing this forward. It's been helpful to sort of to see it all in one place, and I know that we'll be seeing some of these issues come forward prior for some sort of work prior to that next quarterly update. Thank you.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, just to echo, I think it's just endlessly frustrating to be pretending that these are two separate projects and not to see that consolidated plan, which is required for good decision making. So hopefully somehow that will happen to the degree this keeps on progressing. I think it is, worth highlighting again. There are lots of other obstacles for these projects beyond what's on this list, including Clean BC markets and some interesting information I heard from feds. So I guess the other piece I wanted to add is even when we have a contractor, it still puts a burden on our other staff, and we have an obligation to listen to and examine any permit that comes in, but we also have an obligation to balance our workload, and we have applications and work coming in from all sources, and I think we need to be very, very careful that we're prioritizing that work fairly and adequately with local builders, and we have a housing crisis and those sorts of things. So just making sure that we are being very thoughtful in how the work is managed and shared. And the other thing I just can't help, and I'll probably speak to it again tonight, the declaration, emergency declaration we have, the IPCC science and so on, our economic development focus targets. I just have to wonder when I see these resources going, are we doing enough to do what a future requires? And the words and from the youth council and some of the anxiety and emotional challenges they're feeling and stresses, I guess that's weighing heavily on me. And in a perfect world, the people pushing these projects would do a rethink, especially as they watch Europe burn and Lytton burn and so on. Maybe that's too much to hope for, but anyways, venting a little bit, I'll stop.
All right, I'll call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Councillor Rice.
Thank you. Something just occurred to me. Is there any more information on the hydro supply to the site? And I'm just kind of searching my memory. I know there was talk about going through Brackendale on the existing right-of-way. There's been talk, I think, about connecting to the 500 kW line somewhere upstream and taking that directly to the site. Is there any certainty on that that we know of?
Through the chair, it's years since I heard anything on BC Hydro's plans or whether or not they had to upgrade anything to the site. I don't believe so, but I'll follow up because I don't know. I don't.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful because I think, yeah, I keep getting questions from people in Brackendale about that. And I know that it was sometime last term, I think, we had a presentation from Hydro where they talked about upgrading one of the, I think there's actually two side-by-side right-of-ways that run through Brackendale and across Fisherman's Park area. And they were talking about one of them, but then it was kind of, and I'm a little bit fuzzy, I admit, there was talk about avoiding them altogether at one point, and I don't know where we ended up in that or where they ended up on that. And I think certainly the people of Brackendale, I think, would like to know if there's any sort of progress, uncertainty in that.
Thank you, Councillor Rice. Thank you, Mr. Buxton. Council, motion to close. Moved by Councillor Stoner, seconded by Councillor Herford. Any opposed? Motion carries.